So I had all kinds of great ideas for what I wanted to do for GPU June 2 this year, but one by one they all sort of just fell apart. I had all kinds of hardware failures recently, and some of my, really unique ideas turned out to be, well, not so unique. Other people pretty much had the same ideas. And after delaying and going back and forth, I realized I was kind of overthinking things. I don't really need to talk about something unique that nobody's covered before. What about something that's just, truly special? And after thinking about it, it was so obvious. The venerable 3dfx Voodoo graphics card. Released back in late 1996, it completely transformed the world of 3D gaming on the PC. And for me personally, it's always going to have a very special place in my heart. And really, what better card to talk about for GPU June 2 than something like that? At some point back in 1997, I was at a friend's house and he wanted to show me his new video card and how much better Quake looked with it. I was pretty thoroughly obsessed with Quake by that point and I sank countless hours into it, but I was not at all prepared for what I was about to see. This was the very first time I witnessed GLQuake, and I was just completely blown away. The big chunky pixels I was used to at 320 by 200 were gone, replaced by silky smooth textures and lighting effects that I'd never seen before. And not only that, it just did it all so effortlessly. The frame rates were buttery smooth, and 640 by 480 brought sharpness and definition I just never experienced before in a 3D game like that. And my friend's PC was actually quite a bit slower than mine at the time too, a Pentium 133 if I'm not mistaken. It just seemed really hard to believe. And yeah, I know, it's true. To today's standards, this probably doesn't look all that great. I mean, we're looking at blurry textures and dithering and 20 to 30 frames per second, but you gotta understand, this was a monumental leap forward from what was around back then. Anyway, within minutes of experiencing GLQuake, I was totally sold. I absolutely had to have one of these magical cards. And in that summer of 1997, I actually started working my first full-time job. I knew I was supposed to be saving money for school, but there was really no question what I'd be spending my first paycheck on. And not only did I get a 3dfx Voodoo card, I got the Cadillac of Voodoos, the Canopus Pure 3D, a very unique Voodoo card with 6 megabytes of memory, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but I absolutely love that card. So unfortunately I don't have my old Canopus Pure 3D anymore, but I do have this very popular Diamond Monster 3D. And in fact, this was the model that my friend had in his PC when I saw GLQuake for the first time. There were quite a few different card makers that put these Voodoo cards out there, but by far the most popular were the Diamond Monster 3D, like you see here, and the Orchid Righteous 3D. Both were 4 megabyte models, and they were pretty similar for the most part. So the card isn't terribly large, as you can see here, and it looks a lot like most PCI video cards that you'd see at the time. You know, you've got one or more graphics chips here, you've got your RAM DAC or digital to analog converter for your VGA signal, and you've got some memory. But looks can be deceiving because this thing is really nothing at all like your typical video card. And in fact, there's no 2D capability on this thing whatsoever. You won't be able to display your Windows desktop or your old 320 by 200 DOS games. Nope, just 3D accelerated games through supported APIs. And that means you'll need to either purchase or keep your old 2D card in your system for those purposes. And at the time, this was, considered a pretty bold move for 3dfx because pretty much all of the other 3D cards that were hitting the markets had 2D rendering capabilities in them as well. But I think overall it turned out to be a pretty good move for 3dfx because they were able to focus, on what they were best at. And it also left people the ability to buy whatever 2D card best suited their purposes, like for example some of the Matrox cards that really had superior 2D output, and you could have sort of the best of both worlds that way. So the big question of course is how exactly do you hook up a monitor with a single VGA cable to 2 graphics cards in your system? And the answer is with one of these things, a pass-through cable. So as you can see here, it's just a really short VGA cable. The Voodoo has not only a VGA output connector, but also a VGA input for that purpose. There's circuitry on the card that will basically just switch your signal output from the 2D card to the 3D card when it needs to kick in. And yeah, basically just like a tiny version of one of these things. And there's a couple of different ways this can be done. Some cards like the Orchid Righteous 3D, for example, and possibly others, they use mechanical relay switches. And these are kind of neat because they give off a very characteristic click every time they kick in. And it sort of just reminded you that, the card started working. The Diamond Monster 3D here actually has just electrical switching, so it doesn't make any sound when that happens. But I have heard that the mechanical relays can degrade the picture quality a bit, so there's that to consider too. Another thing to keep in mind also is that because there's two separate video signals, you can't have part of the screen rendered in 2D and part of it in 3D. It's basically all or nothing. And that's because of the switching that happens. It can only be either output from your 2D card or output from your 3D card. You can't do both. And this was, not really a big deal for gaming, but it definitely was a clear disadvantage in a two-card setup like this. So there's two chips here on the Voodoo graphics card. So one is labeled TMU, the one on the top, the smaller of the two, and the bottom one is labeled FBI. And yeah, not to be confused with the US law enforcement agency. So the TMU, or the texture mapping unit, is responsible for storing and retrieving textures in its assigned memory area. And although the card does have 4 megabytes of memory total, half of it is actually assigned for texture storage. The other 2 megabytes are used by the FBI or frame buffer chip for all of the 3D processing and other general duties of the card. So the 2 megabytes of frame buffer memory and 2 megabytes of texture memory are connected directly to their associated ICs here through independent 64-bit buses. So they're purpose specific and they can't be shared. And with that amount of frame buffer memory available, it meant that the card was limited to a 640 by 480 resolution in most situations. I mean, theoretically, without certain rendering features enabled, it could go a bit higher, but for all practical purposes, 640 by 480 was the maximum. And that may not sound like much today, but it was a huge improvement over the 320 by 200 that most people were used to for DOS games at the time. And as I mentioned before, some of the Voodoo cards like the Canopus Pure 3D had 6 megabytes of total memory, but that extra memory was texture memory and it couldn't be used for the frame buffer purposes, so the card was still limited to 640 by 480. The extra texture memory could, however, be used to store more or higher quality textures in some games, which was good. Just for historical correctness, I will mention that there was an 8 megabyte Voodoo card released at some point that had 4 megabytes of frame buffer memory and could do 800 by 600, but I've actually never seen one used before, and I would imagine the performance of the Voodoo wouldn't really do well at that kind of a resolution anyway. So the memory on the card is EDO, and you can see it's got, I'm not sure if you can see that too well there, but it's got a 50 nanosecond rating. And in actual fact, the Voodoo 2 that came out a couple years later has half the latency of this at 25 nanoseconds, I believe. The memory runs at 50 megahertz on this card, so that's basically all you need for that. And the processor as well is also at 50 megahertz. So I have heard that you can overclock these. I've never tried, but I believe there is some headroom in them. This stuff's getting pretty vintage right now, so I have no interest in overclocking. I don't want to risk creating too much heat or anything like that. But if you wanted to, I believe you could get a bit of extra performance out of it that way. So yeah, I'm quite excited to get this thing going. So let's take a look at the test setup that I have for this. So I did something kind of special here for my test bench, and I tried to mimic the hardware that I had in 1997 almost exactly. So this is a Pentium setup here with a Pentium Classic 200 megahertz CPU. And when I say classic, I just mean it's not the MMX model. And I've got an Intel 430FX based motherboard here and an S3 Verge for 2D duties here, which is actually a very common card that a lot of people had back in the day and matched them up with Voodoos. And also a Sound Blaster 16, which is an ISA card here, CT2800, another very common card that a lot of people had and is also what I had back in the day. And you can see here that the pass-through cable setup is here. I just have the really short cable here connecting the Verge to the input on the Diamond Monster 3D. And then this cable here goes to the monitor. So on the software side of things, I got a fresh install of Windows 98 2nd Edition here. And you can see that the S3 Verge is actually the only device showing up as a display adapter. And that's because Windows considers the Voodoo a multimedia accelerator device, not a display adapter. And the Voodoo was so popular that Microsoft actually included driver support out of the box in 98 SE, which is kind of interesting. But we're going to update these before running any games to make sure we've got the latest and greatest installed. But before we do this, I want to install some of the bits from the Diamond Monster 3D CD-ROM. It does include a driver, but it's actually older than what Microsoft includes, so I don't really care about that. But what I do want to install are the really cool technology demos that come with it, and I'll show you some of those in a bit. The 3dfx tech demos are actually pretty neat. Most of them are just 3D models that you can rotate around, but a lot of people didn't realize that you could hit F1 to get more options. You can toggle wireframe mode on or off, as well as MIP mapping, bilinear filtering, and you can even see what it looks like without any textures at all. Some of them allow you to get performance stats as well, so you can get a little FPS counter in the bottom left-hand corner. Some of the demos are actually interactive, like this fighting demo here, and you can move the characters back and forth and punch and kick and that sort of thing, but the controls are not intuitive at all, so it took me a long time to figure out how to do anything here. The racing demo is another cool one. It tries to showcase the difference between 3D accelerated graphics on the right compared to software rendered graphics on the left. But the funny thing about this demo is that, as I mentioned before, you can't have 2D and 3D rendering going on at the same time with a Voodoo card because of the pass-through video. The 2D graphics on the left are actually 3D rendered, but just done so in a way that makes it look like 2D rendering. But my favorite demo is definitely this one, where you can navigate around in a first-person view. There's all kinds of interesting rooms you can visit with cool lighting effects and 3D models. And for some reason, you can toss around these yellow glowing orbs at things and watch them fall to the floor. But anyway, that's enough of the demos. Let's go check out a few of my favorite 3dfx glide-powered games from back in the day. So one of my favorite glide games is Turok Dinosaur Hunter, released back in 1997. This game was originally developed for the Nintendo 64 and has a few characteristic traits that were common in those types of games to reduce processing demands. So you'll see like distance fog and things like that. The PC port runs beautifully on a 3dfx Voodoo card. And interestingly, it's one of the few games that wouldn't run without some kind of 3D accelerator in your system, which was actually pretty rare in 1997. Most games would definitely have some kind of a software rendering mode for those without 3D cards, so sort of a sign of things to come. Another great game is Forsaken, released in 1998. It's a multiple degrees of freedom style game very similar to Descent, and in my opinion, it's an awesome showcase of what the 3dfx Voodoo is capable of. It's got lots of great colorful lighting effects, cool weapons and environments, and best of all, it's one of the smoothest running glide games out there that you'll find. Next up is Quake 2, released back in 1997. Although it has a very different look and feel compared to the original Quake, which was one of my favorite games, there's no doubt that it was a technological marvel for its time that really took 3D to the next level. The advanced lighting and other effects do have their costs though, and the game can run a little bit choppy on the original Voodoo.
Fortification near enemy comm facility.
So another popular game with glide support is the Need for Speed 2 SE. This is the free demo version that has only a single car and a single track, but I remember playing this demo for hours back in the day on my old system. It's a lot of fun and it runs great on a Voodoo card, as long as you got a fast enough CPU to go along with it. In my case here, the Pentium 200 does just fine. Another really unique game that I enjoyed playing was MDK. It was originally a software rendered game, but a 3dfx glide patch was later released for it. It's a really fun, fast-paced game with a great mix of action and humor. Unfortunately, most of the game views are letterboxed, which I assume was done to keep the frame rates high, but if you've never played it before, I definitely recommend giving it a go. So that's it for today. I hope you really enjoyed this video. The 3dfx Voodoo was a total legend in the world of PC gaming, and the games of that era were just so much fun to play. It was a great experience for me personally to revisit this card and to put together a setup that was very similar to what I had back in the day. Wanted to give a quick shout out to Nathan, aka Pixel Pipes, for organizing GPU June 2 this year. It's a real celebration of the history of 3D acceleration, and I'm really happy that I was able to contribute this time around. Please be sure to check out the other great videos in the GPU June 2 playlist. There's all kinds of great content from a variety of awesome YouTubers, and I'll put a link to the playlist in the description below. And as always, if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help smaller channels like mine get more exposure. Thanks again.